So, RoH Part One, Scene 2. After clambering awkwardly with the baby through the narrow roof space access ways, Asha came into the fresh air on the angled metal roof of the mall. Standing up in the blustery air, she paused to catch her breath. The wind was strong and tugged at a piece of string, keeping her long hair off her face. After a few good pulls, the wind got what it was after, and the string flew up into the air. Her freed hair framed her in an ocean of curly black threads, flowing around her face and body as if she was underwater. She grinned. It was nice to have the wild air in her hair again. She brushed her locks back from her face with one hand and looked around for potential escape routes. Of all the directions she could go, there was only one building close enough to the mall to jump to, and it was on the back end of the larger building. Letting go of her hair again, she ran the length of the sloped roof and leapt into the air with a carefully calculated kinetic push. It felt like she was flying for several seconds, and then the next building's roof came up to meet her. Steadying the baby with one arm, she landed into a shoulder roll and flipped back onto her feet. She stopped to catch her breath and telepathically checked the whereabouts of the nearest blue suit agents. Some were very close below her, but they seemed to be travelling towards the mall and had not yet been ordered to set up a street cordon. This meant that they thought she was still inside, and this was good. A rusty fire escape ladder led down the building to an alley hidden from the street. When her feet hit the concrete again, she knew instinctively that she had escaped. Despite this instinct, she wouldn't completely relax until she was well away, because the agency trained its people to be persistent. The alley was T-shaped. Left and right led to the streets, and ahead of her a long, narrow space cut between two large buildings. Asha ran straight ahead. She knew much of the alley system of Aram after being on the run for 3 months. She followed that knowledge. Almost instinctively, she shot up and down narrow paths, cobbled lanes and driveways, avoided main streets and areas where there were cameras, always heading far away from the trouble. The further she got, the calmer she became. Finally, several kilometres from the wall, her pace dropped to a walk. She turned and entered a fairly long walkway between two tall brick factory buildings. Right, where to next, she thought. She couldn't go and find the rebels or her brother Talon without the risk of bringing the agency down on them. But living on the street wasn't working either. They would send A2 assassins after her soon, and that would be worse. There had to be some other way to win this. Others had escaped the agency from the high ranks and managed to survive, surely. Still focused on her thoughts, she got within a metre of the alley exit, and a figure stepped inside of the street in front of her. She was forced to back up, just to keep from bumping into him. In the dimness, she didn't immediately recognise the face that stared across at her. When she did, she took a sharp in-breath and stepped back. "No! Asha, wait!" His voice was gentle, almost a whisper. Behind him, she heard the sounds of sirens, and a number of agency vehicles shot past the alley at high speed. When the street beyond was quiet again, he spoke. "I'm here to help you, Asha. You trusted me once. Will you trust me now?" Fighting her instinct to run again, she swallowed. That was a long time ago. "That's true." His voice was sad. "But I offer you and baby Tempest safety from the agency in exchange for your help." She snorted. "And how could I possibly help you?" "Do you remember where the rebel building was located?" "I'll not help you kill the last of them." She turned and strode away from him, but he followed after her. A firm hand grabbed her elbow, pulling her back around to face him. She wondered if she should risk putting him on his ass so she could get free, but then thought better of it. His voice was still gentle. "No, that's not what I want. Will you please hear me out before you disappear?" Scene 3. Talon was sleeping, curled up in a ball in one corner of an empty, dusty apartment. His face twitched, and fists clenched and unclenched under the stress of reliving the horrific memories of his past. 16 years old, he sat under the kitchen table where his father had left him. The lacy decorative cloth covered the view of his surroundings completely. There was a terrible noise around him, but Talon couldn't think. He couldn't feel and couldn't move. Gunshots, screaming, crying. Then it all went silent for a very long time. No thinking, no feeling, just stillness and silence. Sometime much later, a hand moved beside his mother's embroidered tablecloth. Yellow-brown eyes came into view and someone spoke his name. The person touched his face with chilled fingers. Fear and grief flowed through their skin and into him. It hurt. The touch hurt. Someone spoke, but his mind could not understand the words. There was a mental pop and he blinked. "Talon, are you okay, Talon?" Krena Ree was there, her square face covered in tears and her wide eyes fearful. Fighting against the silence in his mind, he lifted his arm from the floor and took her hand from his face. "Please." It was nearly impossible to speak, but he pushed through it. "Please don't touch, it hurts." Krena nodded and shuffled back so she could get out from under the table. There were puddles of blood on the kitchen floor, and people-shaped figures lay under the sitting room throw rugs. He couldn't see his parents or his little sister. He struggled again to speak. Where are they?" "I'm sorry, Talon. They took Usher. Your parents are dead." Tears lifted into her eyes. He wondered why he couldn't feel anything. What's wrong with me?" Krena sighed and shook her head. "I don't know. I think your dad did something to keep you safe." A noise sounded outside and they both looked towards the hallway. "I've got to go. I'm so sorry, young Talon." "Please, open this door." Talon jumped up, flinching violently out of his dream. He came to full consciousness as he landed on all fours, with his back to a corner and staring at the only door in the empty room. It took him several moments to remember where he was. A condemned apartment building. Many street kids lived in its unlocked rooms, and he had been lucky to get his own room away from the cluttered psychic noise of others. Elsewhere in the building, someone yelled fearfully, and he craned his neck to listen. Numerous firecrackers popped downstairs, and he tensed. It wasn't close enough to winter solstice for crackers. That had to be gunfire, which meant there were intruders in the building. Could be space slavers looking for street kids and illegals, but if it isn't the Spades... Mid-thought, he stopped and listened again. Someone was outside his room, and based on the deep sense of ill-ease that had suddenly dropped into his belly, he figured they were not friendly. He had to get out. Being as quiet as he could on the bare wood floor, he crept towards the nearest window. There was a fire escape. If he could unlock the window, he'd be able to get away. Carefully, he fiddled with the old-fashioned turning clip lock. Heavy footsteps came closer down the hall towards his door, and more gunfire sounded below him. The lock slid out of place, and he put his fingers under the window edge. His first effort, a gentle pull, didn't budge it at all. From across the room he heard someone turning the door handle. There was no lock on his door, but there was a chain across it. The door opened, stopping at the length of the chain, but thankfully they couldn't see him because of the angle of it. Through the gap in the door he heard the sound of radio static, and knew at that moment it wasn't Spades slavers. "This is the agency. If you cooperate, you will not be harmed." Talon swallowed down his fear. He couldn't be captured and taken by the agency, not like his little sister Asha. He'd rather die fighting than like his parents, instead of being forced to become an agent simply because he had side genes, and useless, locked side genes at that. Getting a better grip on the edge of the window, he pulled up with a quick and hopefully efficient yank. The window flew open. He rolled out onto the metal fire escape, slipping and half falling onto the ladder. He released the rusty catch and, gripping the metal bar tightly, he and the ladder dropped down to a jolting stop. He climbed to the bottom rung, let go, and landed on the concrete below. Above him there was a loud bang, and he realised that the agent must have broken through the door chain. He looked around at the narrow lane. Going down to the street would likely lead to their vehicles and more armed agents ready to corral him into custody. Up the lane looked like a dead end, but there was a hidden path between buildings that led to the next block over. If he could get there, it would be an easy escape route, likely to be overlooked by his pursuers. Turning, he started to sprint. Gunfire sounded from above, and bullets at the concrete behind him. He flinched but kept running. At the end of the drive was a waist-high concrete fence, which he vaulted. Another volley of gunshots fired, and just as he reached cover, he felt the impact of a bullet in his right shoulder. Swearing, he stumbled but did not fall. The agonizing pain radiated through his back and right shoulder blade into his lungs. The world spun nauseatingly, but he kept running. He had to get as far away as he could. Agents were persistent chasers, and if he didn't fully get away, they could find him again, just as they had others he'd known and lost on the streets. Talon flew out through the narrow gap and crossed the street to the next alley. Which direction should he go now? He doubted he could get the bullet out on his own. Even if he had the right equipment, agony wasn't conducive to sewing stitches in one's own skin. He didn't know any safe street doctors, and official medical facilities were a one-way ticket to the agency. Turning in a southerly direction, he knew there was only one option. He had to try and get to the rebels and to Ren, their healer. Running around pedestrians and up the next street, he searched for another alley or side access way. He had to get under cover and stay concealed for as long as he could. There were government cameras everywhere, as well as cops. Pain in his back was sharp and flared with every beat of his heart, but he stubbornly focused on his goal. This wouldn't be the end. It couldn't. Another alley presented itself to him. He shot straight for it. He ran for 3 blocks, zigzagging through narrow alleys and lanes before his feet started going numb. Stumbling, but still upright, he passed into another lane and slowed his pace. He couldn't hear any agency sirens nearby, so he figured it might be safe to slow down a little. Pushing off one wall with his hand, he kept moving towards the other end of the alley. It looked impossibly long and bent slightly sideways. The world flipped around him like a demented roller coaster, and he stopped to lean on the wall. There were still agents too close by. He couldn't faint now. He had to keep going. He took a wobbly step, legs weakening under his weight, and he dropped slowly to the dirty concrete. Still fighting, but losing, he kept his eyes open for as long as he could, even beyond the capacity to see anymore. Finally, the pain and blood loss dragged him away from consciousness. And scene 4. There was pain in Talon's lungs. He coughed to shift the sensation, but only made it worse. A moan escaped, and he opened his eyes to see a fuzzy concrete in front of his nose. Someone had a hand on his back. The psychic chatter came through their touch. It was nearly overwhelming as the pain. What should I do? He might die, but he could be dangerous. The touch on his back was prickled with shafts of static and a slicing fear. He moaned again and tried to move away from the hand. "Don't," he mumbled. "Don't touch, it hurts." Hand lifted from his back and the psychic noise eased away, leaving only the pain of the bullet. A figure was crouched next to him, and as his sight cleared, the shape sharpened into a girl. She had deep brown eyes and long sandy hair that framed her almost heart-shaped face and messy, uneven ringlets. The girl couldn't have been any older than 14 or 15, and she looked scared. But with the rags she wore and the lack of shoes, she didn't look much like an agent either. Talon smiled slightly. "Hi." "Hello." The fear in her eyes lifted into the kindest smile she had ever seen. The smile dropped into a frown again. What do I do? Should I find someone to call an ambulance?" There was an oddly familiar accent in her voice. "No, don't." He lifted his left arm out from under him so he could use his elbow to push himself up. He remembered running, but he wasn't sure how far he'd gotten before he fell. He might be close to the rebel building, but he could be far away too. What he did know was that he was far too weak to get there on his own. "Who are you?" He felt so drowsy, and it made it hard to talk. She seemed very unsure, and this was reflected in the tiny voice that replied. "Nalana?" "I'm Talon." He frowned. "Shouldn't you be in school? There's no schools out here, not for many blocks." I had to run away. He was going to hurt me. Tears formed in her eyes. She was obviously scared of something or someone. He tried to smile. So, you're in trouble too, huh? And she nodded. Do you know how close the park is? She pointed down the alley. It's not far. You can see it from the end. Other side of the park are some friends of mine. They can help. We'll be safe there. For a while. Her face tensed up and he realised how dangerous it was for a stranger to ask a young person to come home with him. He smiled. How about, could you help me get to them? Burning shaft of pain stabbed through his body. He groaned and closed his eyes to write it out. A warm hand touched his back, and this time he had enough focus to block her psychic clutter from his mind. Through her touch he felt a heat push into the pain. His breathing became easier, and the agony in his back dimmed into a much duller throb. She must be a healer like Wren, but not as strong, he thought. How far from the park are your friends? Leaning his head and good shoulder on the brick wall, he rested for a moment. 2 blocks. The girl stepped around him and offered a hand to help him stand up. Using the wall under his shoulder and her offered hand, he very slowly edged himself upright. She lifted his good arm around her shoulders, but this time her touch wasn't painful at all. She had created an empathic wall between them. As they walked out towards the street, he tried not to lean on her too much, but the world kept spinning slowly sideways, and she was the only thing that was steady. Are your friends psychic too? A weak smile lifted the edges of his mouth. Why do you think I'm Psy? Because you can block emotions. I felt it before. It's no wonder it hurts when someone touches you. All that sensitivity only in your skin. Took me years to learn how to block, and I still can't do it very well. So, are they psychic too? He would have laughed had he been able. They're the Psy rebels? So, yes. They left the alley and stepped into a bright sunlit street. Squinting in the glare and sudden warmth, they wondered when the day had gotten so hot. The nearby road traffic seemed to spin oddly around him, and he fought the vertigo in his head. Nalana put her arm around his waist to support him. With the movement, he felt a wetness down much of his back that could only be blood. In a long gap of traffic, they shuffled slowly towards the road and into the northwest corner of the partially forested city park. The moment they got under trees, blessedly, the light dimmed and the temperature dropped again. Swaying slightly, the two of them walked for a short distance into the grove of massive trees. He could barely see or lift his legs. A wave of nausea added another spinning motion to his perceptions, and he felt heavy all of a sudden. Stopping, he put a hand to the trunk of a tree and closed his eyes for a moment. Wait. The pain in his shoulder and back seemed to fade from him a little. His legs started to give way and Alana spoke, but his mind couldn't process the words. Then, dragging her with him, he dropped onto his hands and knees. There were tree roots in front of him, and he put his hand on the wood, trying to gain more sense of reality. Nalana got out from under his arm and helped him lie on his side, with his back against the tree roots. Talon, her voice sounded desperate. Where are your friends? Other side of the park, he panted. 2 blocks, after the playground. Turn left. His eyes closed and he felt a warm hand on his face. Metal doors. Hold on. She continued to speak, but the sounds flowed over him as he spun slowly away. His last thought was of 11 years ago, his little sister Asha, only 10, in his arms and weeping. I didn't mean to hurt him. He just made me so mad.